to our wonderful Martha's Vineyard Book Festival. We're thrilled to have everybody show up this morning, so thank you for being here. The book festival, as you can tell, is free, but donations are essential to the success of this book festival. A $25 donation will get you a free canvas book bag, and donations can be made at the information booth. There is food available for sale just in front of the Art Shack, and we are very happy to welcome this morning. Our author is Sidney Blumenthal, and his book is Wrestling with His Angel, and he will be interviewed by Tom Ashbrook, who is the host of the NPR's On Point. Following their discussion, there will be time for questions and answers, and at the end, the author will be going over to the book signing table, so we strongly urge you to buy a book if you haven't purchased one yet, and to go and have the author sign it following the program. Thank you all for being here again, and thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is Sidney Blumenthal. Hey.
Thank you, Tom.
It's very nice to be with you. What a beautiful place to be. You're gonna hear two Illinois boys talk about Abe Lincoln today. Big deal. Like, who would be surprised at that? We'll talk about the book. It's really great. I really encourage you to get into it. Sid Blumenthal is as you may well know, a very political man. Chicago kid, Brandeis, was kicked off starting at the Boston Phoenix in the Real paper some months or years ago. Decades? Yes. Of course, wrote for The New Yorker and The Washington Post, and has written for the Vanity Fair. Lots of books under his belt. Became famous, wrote politically, covered politics a lot. Came into the White House as senior advisor to Bill Clinton in 1997, and became one of the very, very closest political confidants of Bill and Hillary Clinton, a status in which I believe he remains. He has been a fierce defender of the Clintons through thick and thin over the years. He was right in the middle of, well, there you are. We're on Martha's Vineyard. Through impeachment proceedings, which may have a little bit of relevance in this country now or soon. Who knows? Who knows?
Now you're really on the vineyard.
Yeah, now we're really on the vineyard, huh? And right on through. When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, he had worked with her, of course, in her campaign. She wanted to bring him into the State Department. Rahm Emanuel, another Chicago kid, said no way, because this had been a tough street fighter in that campaign, and the Obama team was not having him there. But he did remain a close advisor offstage to Hillary Clinton. When her famous emails were revealed, a whole ton of them were from Sid Blumenthal. Republicans like very much to talk about this, even in the last week. Chuck Grassley has been saying, when they chant "lock her up," the next person they start talking about is Sid Blumenthal. Sid just had a letter that he wrote to Chuck saying, lay off, you're putting lies out there about me. Fox News happily covering all of this in some great detail lately. At the same time, and maybe to take on the protective coloration of a historical biographer, he's writing about the unassailable Abraham Lincoln, and writing a 4-volume series, a kind of a political biography of Abraham Lincoln. And the second great volume is just out. It is Wrestling with His Angel. It may sound like serious historical stuff. It's really the stuff of an action film. I want to give you just a little taste from Wrestling with His Angel. And this is in the run-up, 1843. Cassius Clay. You know this name, Cassius Clay? You think it's Muhammad Ali, right? Okay, it's the cousin of Henry, the great Henry Clay. And he was a big anti-slavery proponent in Kentucky. This was rough territory. Here we are, contest for a congressional seat in 1843 from Sid's book. And let's see, he is opposing, is opposing Wycliffe? Clay's against, Cassius is against Wycliffe? He's against him. And he goes out to speak against him. And at a political rally, Wycliffe's cousin Sam Brown is there with a crowd of desperate bullies. This is just running for office. They're running for Congress. Prepared to silence Cassius Clay for good. They called him Cash. To blow his damn brains out. When Clay spoke up against Wycliffe, Brown called him a liar, and his thugs rushed him. This was campaigning and supporting politicians in 1843, not exactly a day in Chilmark. They rushed him. Called him a liar. His thugs rushed him, one thumping him on the head with a club. "Clear the way and let me kill the damn rascal," yelled Brown, aiming a pistol. He fired a shot that bounced off the scabbard of Cassius Clay's knife at his chest. Cassius Clay pulled out his Bowie knife, sliced off Brown's ear, gouged an eye, and slashed his head to the skull. And now we are into the politics of the period that Sid is writing about, okay? So
That's real campaigning.
that's real campaigning, baby. And Sid Blumenthal is the contemporary equivalent of the guy with the Bowie knife out there for his candidates. Meanwhile, and then I'm going to give this to Sid, Abe Lincoln has run for Congress, been in Congress, and then that was kind of the interim end of his political career. He's back home, all kinds of New England connections to Abe Lincoln and Land of Lincoln in these years. William Dean Howells was editor of The Atlantic, and he wrote what Sid calls the fairy tale about these Lincoln years. After he lost, it seemed to be a big political loser, Howells wrote that during this period, he'd relinquished political aspirations, successful in his profession, happy in his home, secure in the affections of his neighbors, with books, competences, and leisure. Ambition could not tempt him. He describes Lincoln as a finished man in repose, awaiting the summons of destiny. Sid Blumenthal calls that the authorized fairy tale. Somebody wrote in an Illinois newspaper at that time, "Lincoln is undoubtedly the most unfortunate politician that has ever attempted to rise in Illinois. In everything he undertakes politically, he seems doomed to failure." This is where Sid Blumenthal picks up Abe Lincoln and takes us with wrestling with his angels. It's Genesis 32, when Jacob wrestles all night with an angel. Sid, set the scene for us. Welcome to Chilmark and welcome to the book festival, and set the scene for your great book for us.
Thank you, Tom. First, I want to say how delighted I am to be at this book festival, and I want to thank Sue Ellen Lazarus, the organizer, Bunch of Grapes, which I hope everybody goes to for their books, and the Vineyard Gazette. I'm very happy to be in Massachusetts, where I spent 20 years of my life, met my wife. Both my sons were born here, so I'm glad to be, again, after Washington, on the free soil of Massachusetts. Abraham Lincoln has failed to get a federal patronage job. He has finished his one term in Congress. He has proposed a bill for emancipation in the District of Columbia. It received not a single hearing. It was never heard. He returns to his gloomy law office in Springfield, Illinois, with his partner, William Henry Herndon, who is the town radical, Lincoln's all-around political aide, the town temperance advocate, and town drunk.
Perfect.
And chronicler, later, of Abraham Lincoln creating the first oral history of any president. And Lincoln stares for long periods of time, what is called his melancholy or depression. And he works through his depression for years. And he says to Herndon, "There's nothing I can do. I'm at the end of my career. I'm a failure. Is there anything to be done? Politics is dead. There seems to be no hope. I have no prospects. What can one do?" That's the beginning.
Herndon says he was a sad-looking man. His melancholy dripped from him as he walked.
Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, turns Lincoln right around and sends him back to her hometown, Lexington, Kentucky, to contest in a case for the Todd family fortune.
This story blew my mind about how wicked and rough the anti-slavery, pro-slavery competition was. I mean, they took her father down, the pro-slavery people.
Her father is Robert Todd, and he is one of the most prominent people in Kentucky. Lincoln is married up. He's married to Southern Belle. She's very educated. Lincoln had spent no more than a few weeks in a blab school on the frontier. She went to a French finishing school. She speaks French. And Lincoln goes to Lexington. Robert Todd is the business partner and political ally of Henry Clay, one of the most powerful people in the country and the most prominent person from Kentucky. He is on the defensive. There's a virulent pro-slavery movement. What they want to do is change the law in Kentucky. Kentucky had what was called a Non-Importation Act. Just follow me for a little bit on this. It prevented slaves from being brought into Kentucky for sale. Slaves themselves were the greatest asset and capital value in the entire country, apart from all the real estate. On the slaves were built the entire economic structure of the country. Mortgages, derivatives, the financial sector, Wall Street, State Street in Boston, all built on slavery. So Kentucky had been the most restrictive slave state in the South. And now there's a virulent pro-slavery movement that wants to get rid of this act. There's a lot at stake economically and politically. Robert Todd is, with Henry Clay, against this movement. The leader of this movement is a man named Charles Wycliffe, known as the Old Duke. He's an attorney. He's a wealthy slave owner. And he had married Robert Todd's cousin. She dies, and he inherits the Todd family fortune. So the politics and the case are intertwined.
And the money.
And a lot of money. And Lincoln is sent in as the co-counsel by Mary to represent the Todd heirs v. Wycliffe, and the Todd heirs side of it. And he discovers the entire politics of Kentucky at that time. Now, he loses the case. The pro-slavery forces win politically. Robert Todd dies of cholera. This is embittering on a personal level, on a political level, and Lincoln sees what this new slavery movement is like. And he is deeply angry about it. He bears this anger in private for years. He says that young slave owners in Kentucky he has seen have the most ostentatious, glittering form of property trailing after them, slaves. And it makes him really angry, and he believes that this movement will now work to nationalize slavery and make it legal across the entire country. And he is not wrong. But there's a kicker to the story, if I can,
Yes,
Tom.
please.
Here's the kicker. Lincoln also learned something else, and this is what he learns about this case. There is an heir to the fortune, but the problem is the heir to the Todd family fortune is not legally a person. He is a slave. Polly Todd Wycliffe's son, who had died early, had an affair with her housemaid, who was a slave. And they had a son. She emancipated the son and the housemaid, but sent them to Liberia. So the true heir to the Todd family fortune had been exiled. This was known to all the principals in the case. And there's a further kicker. This slave, who was freed as a boy, who has a name, whose name is Francis Russell, becomes the president of Liberia. Which means that Mary Todd Lincoln was related to two presidents.
That's a pretty good kicker. This is an amazing time. Lincoln is back in Illinois. In my family, I'm from Bloomington, Illinois, which is right in the middle of Illinois. My forebears were the first European settlers of that county. Lincoln lived with my aunt, Polly Cameron, in New Salem. He boarded with her and her family when he was a young man there. The stories of Lincoln in this time that you write as this sort of Slav despond, they're beloved stories in central Illinois. This is when he was riding the circuit with David Davis, the famous judge who first practiced law in Lenox, Massachusetts, married out of Lenox, Massachusetts, became a big hometown hero in my hometown, Bloomington, Illinois. He becomes this great raconteur. I'm sure that started before he was 40, but he was polishing that all at this time, Lincoln. He was studying Euclid, which seems a very funny thing to be doing in your 40s, but it was always on his mind, mastering the axioms of politics, and this, as you describe it, being Lincoln becoming a new Lincoln during this time. It struck me how that time like this one is when the slavery, you might have expected it to be declining over the years, but it was resurgent. The Mexican War had been won, and they wanted to move slavery in there. This busted the Missouri Compromise. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was being fought over all the time. Lincoln in the middle of that fighting with Douglas. So he's practicing law. He's watching these national developments. He's seeing his old party, the Whig Party, decline. He would ultimately found the Illinois Republican Party in my hometown, Bloomington, with Jesse Fell, Adlai Stevenson's great-granddad there. And he's undergoing what you describe as a process of transfiguration. Put us in the national moment and inside Lincoln's mind in relation to that, as he's looking to become a new Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln is now traveling from county courthouse to courthouse in central Illinois, sometimes on a horse, Old Bob. And he is part of a merry band led by Judge David Davis of Bloomington, who is a heavy-set maestro of the legal community. And these lawyers travel together, and they pick up cases in the towns, and the judges travel with them. And they all board together. They're an entourage. And
we have beloved stories of them crossing rivers at midnight with their documents over their heads on the backs of their horses and all this jazz.
Yeah, this little group of obscure provincial lawyers will become the heart of his political machine that will defeat everybody else in the entire country to grab the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. These are, while they seem to be these lawyers in these obscure places, are some of the most experienced and canniest political operators in America. And they learned this in Illinois. The politics of Illinois are very contentious and difficult. Lincoln is a Whig. The party of Lincoln is the Whig Party. It's the party of Henry Clay. It's the party of the American system, of internal improvements, of infrastructure, of government activism. It's pro-business, and Lincoln is a stalwart of this party. His opponent in Illinois from the 1830s on is Stephen A. Douglas, who is a meteor, who rises far above him, who becomes a judge on the state Supreme Court, who becomes a senator, and as a senator, in his 30s, takes legislative control to create the Compromise of 1850, which to him was just a predicate to the really important thing, which was the Illinois Central Railroad Act.
It really bums Lincoln out because they're rivals. They're contemporaries in age, and he's meteoric, and Lincoln is bumping along, going nowhere.
Lincoln feels that the little giant is barely 5 feet tall. Lincoln is 6'4". And Lincoln says, I walk beneath his legs like he is a colossus. And he feels that his life that he is a flat-out failure, he says. And Douglas has gone far beyond him. Douglas has control and manages all the lobbies in Washington. He has the financiers of Wall Street. He has bribed all the committee chairmen in the Congress to pass all these bills, and he becomes extraordinarily wealthy himself.
And he's super racist.
He actually, through his first wife, owns a Mississippi plantation.
William Seward told him, Stephen, you'll never be president as long as you spell Negro with 2 G's.
That's correct. He always used that word on the floor of the Senate, often, and used that as a major part of his politics. And if you reread the Lincoln-Douglas debates, you will see that Lincoln is spending his entire time contesting with Douglas's ferocious racism and demagoguery, which is very effective in Illinois, which is the most racist northern state of its time, with draconian black laws restricting free blacks.
Would you describe those, because they were pretty incredible?
Well, they would be laws about when blacks could be out at night, when they could have employment, who could employ them. There are even laws about coming into the state.
It was hard to exist as a black person in Illinois.
It was very hard, but there were free blacks in Springfield, and Lincoln had relations with him, and he knew that half a block away from him on Jackson Street in Springfield, one of his neighbors, who was an African American, ran a station of the Underground Railroad out of his house.
As did Jesse Fell, great-grandfather of Adlai Stevenson.
Jesse Fell
In my hometown.
from Bloomington was also involved in the Underground Railroad. And Lincoln, when he was in the Congress, lived in a boarding house on which is now the present site of the Library of Congress. So if you see the Library of Congress, just imagine a row of boarding houses facing the Capitol. The fourth one was where Lincoln lived. It was called Abolition House. It was filled with Whigs and the most anti-slavery people in the Congress. Joshua Giddings of Ohio lived there. Yeah, so the owner of it, Mrs. Sprigg, was also running an Underground Railroad station out of the place, and slave catchers at one point ran into the place and grabbed one of the waiters, which they all had to run and purchase him in order to get him back. So, Lincoln has seen a lot. Down the street in Washington, from the boarding house, where near the site of the present Supreme Court building, was a slave pen, a very large slave pen, right on Maryland Avenue. And that's where they kept and sold slaves, and then would march them down either to the present site of the Navy Yard and ship them south, or to Georgetown, to the port there.
Could you bring it to Boston for a minute, and the story of what was it, Burns, Anthony Burns, 1850? That's vivid as it gets, when this was all about slaves being returned to their owners, and it came right into the heart of Boston, and it got very vivid. Just to give a sense of how vivid this all was.
Well, here, this goes to the heart of the Compromise of 1850, which codified a federal Fugitive Slave Act. And Boston was the center of the resistance. And what happens is that there's a very highly organized free black community on Beacon Hill, on the north slope of Beacon Hill. They run newspapers. They have organizations. They're connected to a group of Whigs who dissent from the Whig Party, and they become called Conscience Whigs. Their leader is Charles Sumner, who becomes the senator. And an escaped slave makes his way, Anthony Burns, to Boston, to this community, because they would then send them north to Canada. And his owner comes, and there's
From
some
the South to reclaim him.
to reclaim
Virginia.
him. There's something called the Boston Vigilance Community. It's led by, among others, Sumner and Theodore Parker, who is the pastor of the church on Beacon Hill.
Full of transcendentalists there.
All the transcendentalists go to his church. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau relates to him. So this is quite a community in Boston. And there's a slave also named Thomas Sims in 1850. They call in a meeting, and they storm for Burns. They try and storm the courthouse, and the federal authorities have to call out 1,000 federal troops to march this slave from Beacon Hill down to the wharf to a boat that will take him back to slavery.
Huge crowds coming out. I mean, you've got an emergency meeting at Faneuil Hall, overflow crowd, everybody just wild about this. They know what is threatened here. They don't want this single man to be taken. Boston is placed under martial law. On June 2nd, to execute the order of rendition, more than 1,000 U.S. troops are mustered on Boston Common. 125 police join them. A loaded cannon is stationed at the courthouse door aimed at the crowd. More than 50,000 people fill the streets and crowd every window on the route from State Street to the wharf. Burns is brought out in handcuffs and marched at the center of a phalanx of soldiers and police. They take him. I mean, the abolitionists just go crazy. The failed rescues marking the beginning of a new phase. Sid Blumenthal writes, the Anthony Burns affair was Lexington Green for this moment, he writes. And, quote, we went to bed one night old-fashioned conservative compromise union Whigs and waked up stark mad abolitionists. He quoting, this is Amos Adams Lawrence, the wealthy mill owner.
After whom Lawrence, Massachusetts
Of course,
is named.
yeah. They've got a big anti-slavery meeting in Framingham on July 4th, just a month later. William Lloyd Garrison is there. He sets fire to the Fugitive Slave Act. He sets fire to the court order rendering Burns to Georgia, and to the Constitution, damning it as a, quote, covenant with death and an agreement with hell and calling for dissolution of the Union. Henry David Thoreau of Concord delivers a speech there in Framingham. Slavery in Massachusetts is the title of it. The law, he said, will never make men free. It is men who have got to make the law free. Just to give you a sense, 50,000 people coming out to protect this one slave from repatriation to the South.
All right, now here's the politics of it. This is very unpopular in the rest of the country. From our perspective,
here we are again.
From our perspective, of course, this is, astounding and it's morally right. But from the rest of the country, this is seen as the anti-slavery agitation, and the federal and the dominant authorities in both the Whig and the Democratic parties are determined to put an end to this agitation. That's what the Compromise of 1850 is supposed to do, and it does. It removes slavery as a controversial issue from national politics, so politics can proceed without talking about slavery. And they can do business as usual. The only place where this goes on is around Boston and in New England. Now, the anti-slavery politics is really complicated. It's as complicated, even more complicated, than the factionalism of the left in the 30s or even today. And among the abolitionists, there are abolitionists and there are abolitionists. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe, who writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, does not care for William Lloyd Garrison. Mm-hmm. And there are all sorts of political disagreements. Garrison hates politics. He doesn't want to do anything to do with politics. He thinks it's impure. Then there are others who, like Salmon P. Chase, who's known as the Attorney General for fugitive slaves, who becomes the senator from Ohio and the founder of the Republican Party of Ohio and becomes Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, founds early on, active in the Liberty Party of 1840, a new political movement against slavery. All of that works its way through small parties up to the Free Soil Party of 1848 and eventually into this new party called the Republican Party that's founded in 1856.
But Lincoln is wrestling all this. You describe his political evolution. You show in one of his speeches, and I want you to read this. It's so interesting. Lincoln kind of trying to trim on blacks, and not exactly on slavery, but this is a speech, is it Peoria or is it Washington, where, listen to Lincoln here. He's anti-slavery, but he doesn't want to offend, and maybe even in himself, he's very ambivalent about blacks in America. And I would love it if you would just read this from Lincoln's speech, Sid.
Here, let me set the stage for this. Stephen A. Douglas, who was the legislative magician to pass the Compromise of 1850, removing slavery from national politics, then is ambitious to become president. The worm is in his brain. He wants to be president. He's run in 1852. He's run a miserable campaign. He was 37. He had insulted everybody in the party. They all hate him. They all think he's a party of one. No one trusts Stephen A. Douglas, but he's powerful. He's an enormous demagogue, and
Alcoholic in a temperance time.
he is, like many people, he's a raging alcoholic, and he's also very wealthy and has a lot of power through his connections to financial and political powers and all the lobbyists in Washington.
Lincoln's a teetotaler, let us know.
Yeah, Lincoln is nobody, and Douglas is a meteor, and he wants the Republican presidential nomination. He's screwed it up in 52. He wants it in 56. But how's he going to do it? He had done the Illinois Central Railroad Act, which was created federally chartered railroads and spurred the Industrial Revolution and basically ignited the city of Chicago, where Douglas had owned all the land on the lakeshore and sold it to the railroad for the right of way. And
Trump.
and and Douglas now wants to create a transcontinental railroad, which he feels will be the equivalent of that, and this will be the vehicle to carry him to the presidential nomination. There's a problem. There's 1,000 miles of territory between the established states and the West. So what do you have to organize that territory. It includes what's called Kansas and Nebraska, and it includes all the land that had been taken from the Mexicans in the Mexican War. So he works a deal. It's the art of the deal is all in here on what he does, and he basically blows up politics. They repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had prohibited slavery in the North across a line of latitude except for Missouri, and that opened the entire question of slavery again in national politics. Lincoln suddenly emerges again, and politics now is in complete turmoil. All the parties start disintegrating. The Whig Party, which had lost in a landslide, disintegrates into northern and southern factions. The southern Whigs are all going to join the Democrats. The northern Democrats...
Andrew Jackson's super populist party, the Democrats at that time.
Well, many of Jackson's closest people who were still alive were founders of the Republican Party, like Francis P. Blair of Blair House, and who had edited the Washington Globe newspaper and was essentially the voice of Andrew Jackson. Writes a piece against Douglas in 1856 called "A Voice from the Grave," unread by our current president, denouncing slavery.
Along with much else.
And yes, as well as the entire Library of Congress. So Lincoln now goes into the library of the Illinois State Capitol, the Law Library, and he writes a speech. It's his longest speech. And he lays out the constitutional, political, and moral reasons to be against Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in it, he says that slavery is morally wrong, and he lays out how the Constitution was not pro-slavery, the case for that, and how his principles are based on the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. But he's grappling with the politics of race and slavery in his time, as politicians grapple with the politics of race today. and he's trying to get from here to there in a time of complete party chaos.
Where does he deliver this speech?
He delivers this speech in what is called the Hall of Representatives, or the Illinois House in the state capitol, on October 4th, 1854. And it's all of Lincoln's politics from 1854 to when he becomes president and elected in 1860 derive from this very elaborate speech. And it also reflects Lincoln's character, his immense self-discipline, his self-taught education, the way in which he brings these elements together, and his political sensitivity, his desire to persuade and to bring along as many people as he can. He has a difficult problem, how to create an anti-slavery coalition against this act and to politically be effective.
In a racist time, a racist state, certainly.
And always, all the way through, including all the way through the passage of the 13th Amendment, we're dealing with this persistent American problem, as we know today. So if you'd like me to read this, Lincoln says, "If all earthly power were given to me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land. But a moment's reflection would convince me that whatever of high hope as I think there is, there may be in this in the long run, its sudden execution is impossible." And he goes on and he says, "Free them all? What then? Keep them among us as underlings? Is it quite certain that this betters their condition? I think I would not hold one in slavery at any rate, yet the point is not clear enough for me to denounce people upon." And what he means is, he's not blaming the Southerners for being slaveholders, but wants to appeal to them. What next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit it this, and if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of white people will not. Whether this feeling accords with justice and sound judgment is not the sole question, if indeed it is any part of it. A universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded. We cannot then make them equals. It does seem to me that systems of gradual emancipation might be adopted, but for their tardiness in this, I will not undertake to judge our brethren of the South. So he's separating himself from the Garrisons, who were denouncing the Southerners as morally repellent. And remember, Lincoln is operating in Illinois, which is populated by people who have come from Kentucky, like his own family did.
So here we are. He's wrestling with his angel. You describe this, and it's this sort of quietude in a way in his life, except everything, the foundation for everything is being laid. You describe it as a period of transfiguration. I'm going to take questions in just a couple of minutes here, but how would you summarize the transfiguration? What is it that he's wrestling with? Night after night, he's sitting in his nightshirt here. You describe Lyle Dickey traveling with him, an old conservative Whig. They're in a boarding house on his legal circuit in 1855. They argue and talk deep into the night about the Constitution and slavery and what's going to happen. And Dickey says Lincoln sat up in his nightshirt on the edge of his bed, arguing deep into the night. And then Dickey goes to sleep. He wakes later. Lincoln would often light a candle by his bed and keep reading in the night, Euclid or never mind what it is. But he wakes up and Lincoln is half sitting up in bed. And he says, "Dickey, I tell you, this nation cannot exist half slave and half free." Dickey says, "Oh, Lincoln, go to sleep." What is at the heart of the wrestling you describe in this wonderful book, Sid?
In the beginning of this book, Lincoln doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know what to do with himself. He doesn't see any opening in American politics, and he is a supremely political person. He feels his political career has been at a dead end. He's been in politics for decades already. By the end, he's on the stage. He has given his speech against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He is against the nationalization of slavery in the country. He believes that this virulent movement, which is the dominant power in the country, which controls the executive, which controls the legislative branch, the Congress, and controls the Supreme Court, and would soon issue the Dred Scott decision, which would seem to open up the nationalization of slavery.
And you got Jefferson Davis right there in Washington building the Capitol building with slaves. Jefferson Davis.
Jefferson Davis is the Dick Cheney of his day. He is the power behind the throne of Franklin Pierce, who is a weakling and a drunk and his Mexican War comrade. And Jefferson Davis is the Secretary of War. And he is the ex officio member of what's called the F Street Mess, where all the chairmen of the key Senate committees, all Southerners, live together and run the Congress. They're all the heirs politically and the protégés of the late John C. Calhoun, and as Davis is. And they are determined to nationalize slavery. Lincoln sees all this. He's living with it. And now it comes. And now the crisis is upon them. In 1854, it started. And Lincoln delivers his Kansas-Nebraska speech, and he is not going to stop being on the stage. He has seen in Kentucky, in the Todd Ayers case, what this will be like. And now he comes to this realization that the country, early on, cannot exist half slave and half free, a sentiment he will voice in 1858 when he announces for the Senate against Stephen A. Douglas, which his conservative Whig friends don't want him to say because they think it is too radical to say. And he will also say that he wants to put slavery on the course of ultimate extinction. He doesn't have the plan, but he has the determination.
Things are coming to a full boil here. May 21st, 1856. David Atchison leads an army of nearly 1,000 pro-slavery Missourians under a red banner inscribed Southern Rights into the free state town of Lawrence to ransack it. And they're not fooling around. They burned like 1,000 houses to the ground. The next day, in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, while Charles Sumner sat writing at his desk, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina battered him with a cane, nearly killing him in the Senate chamber in retribution for Sumner's mocking of Brooks' cousin, Senator Andrew Butler, patriarch of the F Street Mess. 2 days later, on May 24th, along Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, John Brown and his band of volunteers hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death. May 29th of that year, Abe Lincoln, you have him hurtling on a train to Bloomington, Illinois, my hometown, for the founding of the Illinois Republican Party. And everything begins. You quote Ralph Waldo Emerson. I mean, this part of the country is watching every part of the country. Who says later, Lincoln, his mind mastered the problem of the day, and as the problem grew, so did his comprehension of it. Rarely was man so fitted to the event. And there you leave us. Now he's ready for glory.
Well, no, there's more tribulation ahead. I leave him.
Aren't they always together?
He's on the train. He's about to found the Illinois Republican Party in Bloomington, Illinois, in 1856, and it will be that vehicle that carries him to the Republican nomination for president. And his very election itself was the cause for the creation of the Confederacy and secession, because they lost national power. They lost control of all the branches of government with the election of a president who was anti-slavery, determined to set slavery on the course of ultimate extinction. And that was enough for them to withdraw from the Union.
We have 3 minutes for questions. Questions? Yes.
A number of years ago, I went to an exhibit about Lincoln and the Jews. A number of years ago, I went to an exhibit, I think it was in the New York Historical Society, about Lincoln and the Jews. And it made the point that it was the support of, and I don't remember the name, you'll know it, a particular Jewish friend of his who both helped financially but really more masterminded his rise. Is that true?
Lincoln had a number of Jewish friends going back to Illinois, and but he didn't. There was no mastermind. There was no his
David Davis was the mastermind, was he not?
Well,
much?
Lincoln was the mastermind,
okay.
and he had these associates from his entourage, and he did have financiers locally. Who were local merchants, mainly the Bunn family. If you remember the Bunn coffee makers, it's the same family. They ran a general store in Springfield, and they financed Lincoln's campaigns. But I'd like to take just a couple other questions. But one thing I do want to say about this is that, which relates to this issue, Lincoln was deeply opposed to the anti-immigrant know-nothings. The Jews of the time were all of German origin and had come over in the great wave of immigration after the failed liberal revolution of 1848. And they were part of it, part of this wave. The Germans transformed Illinois politics because they became a major constituency. And they were all liberal-minded, and they actually made possible the rise of the Republican Party in Illinois, among other things. Lincoln hated the know-nothings. He said...
Who were brutal, who killed 23 in one day in Louisville on one election day to discourage them from going to the polls.
Right,
Let us remember our history.
This was the first great wave of immigration. It was the Irish and the Germans. And there was a new party. As these parties broke up over slavery, a new party arose. It was an anti-immigrant party. They were called the Know-Nothings or American Party. They had one platform plank, which was that only native-born Protestants could hold public office in the United States. Lincoln said, we began with the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Now we have people who say, all men are created equal except Negroes. He says when the know-nothings take power, it will say all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. He said I would prefer to emigrate to
Russia,
to a despotic place, to Russia, where they do not have the base alloy of hypocrisy.
Despotism straight up. Sid Blumenthal's new book is Wrestling with His Angel. It is a terrific read. I can't recommend it highly enough. Sid, thank you very much for being with us today. Thanks for coming. Enjoy your day.
Thank you very much.
At the author's tent just over this way.